Does your kid want a better bed? You can build it. I'll show you how. Let's get to it. So the first thing that I'm going to do for this build is I'm going to cut the slats that are going to support the bed frame. So in preparation for the slat cut, what I've done is I set up a stop block at 39 inches, the length of the slats for the bed, and I put an auxiliary fence on my miter saw. This will allow me to get repeatable cuts, and that way they all come out the same size in case there's any miscalculation on my 39 inches. Don't think there will be though. So the next thing that we're going to do in this test is we're going to cut to 76 inches. Now these are going to be the runners. There's going to be 3 of them, so after I cut this board to length, I'll rip it to size on the table saw. So when I cut this piece, I want to be on this side of the line because this is my keep piece and this is my scrap piece. So I don't want to undercut it because I can always trim off more later. So I'll pull the saw down to take a look at it and look at the blade. And as you can see, the blade's right on that line, and that'll probably take it out, which I don't want because it's right at 76. I can sneak up on it, but I think that's going to be good. Let's find out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rip this board down into 3 strips. Make sure I got my blade height right. Check my fence.
If you like what you see, do me a solid, subscribe.
So I've set my fence to 3/4 inch from this side of the blade. That way the depth of my dado is as wide as the board that we were going to use to mate it, give it a nice flush look. And then I've set the other depth, I guess that's right, to 3/4 inch down, just to give me a nice square bit to put it in. It's also half the width of the 2x4. Okay, so now that we've got all the rabbets cut and the sides cut, we're going to go ahead and assemble them together, and we'll do that by gluing and screwing them. I've got clamps set up so that I can keep things braced how I want them.
So here I'm cutting all 6 posts at the same time to ensure that they're the same height. Here I'm cutting the dados for the post to fit to the frame. I'm using the fence to set my depth at the appropriate heights, that way I can get repeatable cuts. Now we'll place the post on the bed frame, but it's important to know that we don't want to permanently attach it because we need to get it into the room, and this is a pretty big bed. Here I'm cutting the slats for the side walls. I will nail these onto the posts, that way it'll be one piece. I clamped the bottom slat in place, and I will use that as a resting place to put the other slats on and nail them in place with my brad gun, and then I'll come back and get the bottom one when I'm done. Here I'm cutting out the support braces for the front wall and the ladder pieces, the rungs that they'll use to climb up. Now we'll cut the dados for the ladder rungs, and then we'll ensure that they have a tight fit. Cutting the rabbets for the support pieces, that way it'll slip in alongside the frame. So here I'm assembling the ladder. Brad nailed the ladder rungs into place, but later it looked like there was too much pressure on it, so I ended up screwing them in place. So I'm placing the ladder on the frame, but I don't want to permanently mount it because, again, it's got to get in the room. Then I'm going to measure it out and make sure that I get the appropriate size for the slats.
No!
Boop. Well, you know what they say. Measure once, cut twice. And with that, all that's left to do is to build the roof. We will start by cutting the joist and the king's post. When cutting rabbets in the joist, it's important to measure to the right side of the blade, or else you'll have to cut 1/8-inch spacers.
For the dados for the ladder, we're just going to take real world measurements.
I glued and screwed the joist to the king's post, but not the ladder pieces.
So I've lined the board up down there with this corner on that corner of the joist for the rafter, and then up here I'm going to make a mark at 3/4 of an inch in, give me my halfway point, because that's where I'm going to want the two rafter tails to match up. And then I'll angle this rafter up, and I will use this as a measurement, put that on my center line, and come up 7/8 of an inch, because that's what my plans call for. And once I'm at 7/8 of an inch, I'll hold that in place, I'll clamp it, draw my line across there, my line coming up, and that's going to give me my crow's foot so that it sits on the king post just right. And then I'll go down there and I'll mark that out. And I'll mark my line here. And that'll allow me to set it flat here and have my crow's foot.
Here I am cutting out the joint on the bandsaw. Sorry my big hand is in the way. I was looking at the bed compared to my original design, and I decided that I would like to add another support post in the back. I cut another post just like the first 6, and then I moved on to notching the joist for the post. I figured I should notch it before this became one big roof piece. Here I'm gluing and nailing the rafters in place, then I screw them into the joist to ensure a good hold. I cut boards for all the pieces for the top wall, then I glued and nailed them in place. I made sure they were oversized because I will trim them next. Here we are pulling a chalk line to give us a line to cut to. This will ensure that we get a straight line that matches up with our 2x2. So I set the depth of the blade to match the thickness of the board I'm cutting through. This way if I veer off of my line, I won't cut through my 2x2.
So here's a fun lesson. If your dad comes over to help you draw a chalk line and he's been drinking, don't let him loose with a circular saw. Yeah, you probably have to add some fancy trim then.
So to fix this problem, we will create some fancy trim. We'll just take a 2x2 and put a 45 bevel on it, 1/2 inch out. Here I'm using an angle finder to get the right angle where these two pieces of trim will meet. I'm using the combination square to get a right angle off the bottom of this panel and placing the angle finder on the top. Then I lock it in place and transfer the angle to my miter saw. Be sure to find both angles because they are different slopes and they won't match up if you cut the same angle twice. With the trim cut, I could glue and nail this mistake away. Now we can cut the roof slabs for the top of the bed. The fitting for my air hose went bad and I had to use a hammer and nails. Sometimes you can do it old school. hammering and nailing wasn't as fun as using a brad gun with that satisfying sound. So I made it work. I put a clamp in at the top of the two rafters to hold it together at the right distance. And then I put all the boards in on one side without the skylight. I put one board in on the other side with the skylight to hold it in place so I could remove the roof and work on it, not on a step stool. I used the angle finder to give me the angle for where the roof slats would meet up. I made sure to get two different angles for each piece that would be jutting next to each other. Now I could finally glue and nail in the last of the roof slats.
So I ended up making a batten for this front panel here because the boards are just so bowed and warped that it's making it difficult to keep them flush, and I'd rather not sand that much. So I just took a piece of scrap, cut a rabbet in it, and now I'll feed it in there. I'll glue it to the panel here and then nail it in place.
I ripped some 2x2s in half to align the roof slats. I glued them up and then handed them off to the neighborhood leprechaun to hold in place while I nailed them. And then it was time to sand. When it's time to sand, it's a good time to call the paint fairies to come and paint your project. The only problem with paint fairies, if you've never used them before, is they tend to put glitter in your paint. I screwed the sides of the bed into the 2x4 on the frame. I screwed the front wall through the ladder post into the side of the frame. Then I screwed the support post into the side post to make this assembly work. With this done, we could put on the roof and secure it. To attach the post to the roof, I pre-drilled and then used a countersink bit to make a hole for the screw head. For the ladder post, I drove a screw down through the rafter.
All in all, I'm really happy with how this build turned out. My daughter loves it. It's a blast. The paint fairies that it sparkles into the paint on all the pink. I don't know if you can see that or not, but I think it was well worth it. Both of my kids are already climbing up on the roof, and they love the sunroof as an easy access to do that, even though I've told them not to. This bed was a lot of fun to make, and it's got great storage underneath for my daughter to store all of her toys. I'll catch you on the next one.